Thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 12, The Comedy of Democracy. In episode 7, we talked about how the theater was invented in ancient Athens, and how the emergence of theater seems to be related to the emergence of democracy. We explored how public entertainment may have contributed to the functioning of that earliest of democracies. But in that episode, we focused our discussion on the genre of tragedy. We left out half the picture of what was going on in the theater, because in the same festivals of the god Dionysus, when thousands of people gathered to watch tragedies, they also watched comedies. These comedies were quite vulgar. I mean, they were full of scatological humor, sexual profanity, and lots of fart jokes. They were also highly political, just like the tragedies were very political, but the comedies were political in a different sort of way. These plays often directly attacked prominent individuals in the city. We mentioned in episode 8 that Socrates was often parodied in the theater. And he was in the audience, by the way, as were the many politicians who were periodically roasted and humiliated on the comic stage. Now, the role of satire in society is an issue that's as relevant today as it ever was. And so in this episode, we're going to further explore the relation between entertainment and politics in Athens, but we're going to do it through a comedic lens this time. We're going to look at what it was like to see Athenian comedies, what these plays were all about, and what they tell us about life in ancient Athens. These plays are not only of historical interest. In recent years, there have been many revivals of ancient Athenian comedies by artists who feel that these plays resonate with contemporary issues. A good example of this is Spike Lee's film Chirac, which is based on the play Lysistrata by Aristophanes, the only Athenian playwright whose comedies we still have. And there have been many other recent productions of Aristophanes' plays. As Will Ferrell's character Mugatu in Zoolander would say, Aristophanes, so hot right now. But what is it about Aristophanes that seems to have such lasting appeal? With us today to help us understand what all the buzz is about is someone who needs no introduction for many of you. You've seen her in documentaries about the ancient world. You've heard her on the BBC. Edith Hall is one of the most internationally known scholars of ancient Greece. Based in King's College, London, where she is professor of classics, she has written many books, including her latest hit, Introducing the Ancient Greeks, which has already been translated into 7 languages. She's also written plenty on the history of theater, including her 2010 book, Greek Tragedy, Suffering Under the Sun. She joins us now to give us a clearer view of the Athenian comic stage. Edith Hall, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Very nice to be here.
Both tragedy and comedy were invented close to the time democracy was established at Athens, although tragedy preceded that transition and comedy seems to have emerged after. Which of these genres do you think is more closely connected to democracy?
I think that comedy is much more closely related to democracy than tragedy is, because it starts at Athens after the first democratic revolution of 507. It starts about 20 years later. You get the establishment of competitions in comic theatre at the Dionysus. This is a huge step forward. We also hear about similar things happening under democracies around that time in Megara, which is quite close to Athens, and in Syracuse in Sicily. And the ancients connected that with democracy. And you could actually see why, because it's, I think, an important part of democracy, which was the accountability of elected leaders and magistrates. You can hold them to account in a court and make them show all their taxes and inspect all their doings, or you can hold them to account in the theatre by making the most fun of them as you possibly can and seeing whether they survive that to be elected.
So in these old comedies, the actors would actually point fingers at magistrates in the crowd and ridicule them?
We have many instances in Aristophanes where it's made clear that somebody famous is in the audience and part of the whole community. The most famous one is actually in his Knights, which is a long attack on the current most popular leader of the people, Cleon, where he twice has one of the actors say, that Cleon man there in the audience. So we know he was actually in the audience. So it's a wonderful sort of collective. People will have been watching how Cleon reacted as much as they will have been seeing how far Aristophanes would push it. It's actually part of the accountability process. And we all know that top leaders who can't smile at satire against them, I mean, they go down in public estimation. You've got to be seen to see the joke, even if you actually hate it.
So when people today think of comedy, the number one feature that we think of is laughter. But was making the audience laugh the number one priority of the playwrights at this time?
The Athenian playwrights are aiming to win a competition. That is their sole aim. So you could please somebody in a comedy by other means than just making people roll in the aisles. Of course, if they enjoyed it for other reasons. So, for example, the Birds of Aristophanes has got a 24-strong chorus of birds who sing the most beautiful bird songs in that, which might not have been hysterically funny all the way through, but it was thoroughly delightful. In a lot of ways, old comedy was quite close to the lighter form of North American musical. So pleasure need not necessarily be laughing every single minute. However, I think that Aristophanes saw that laughter was instrumental in lots of other things, like attacking politicians. Getting people together to laugh against someone is a political act. So I don't see laughter in a sort of abstract as the important thing, but generally having a jolly good time and developing collective views. And laughter is part of that. Enjoying a good song is part of that.
Do we know what the word comedy, do we know the etymology of that word?
We do know the etymology of the word comedy. Komos is a procession when people are very, very drunk, and very often at the end of drinking parties, you sort of go out in the street together and form a procession. And because Dionysus is the god of wine, the komos belongs to celebrating Dionysus. The ode part just means song. So it's really was felt to grow out of revelrous, riotous, drunken processions after big feasts for the god Dionysus.
And how often could the Athenians see comedies?
The comedies were put on in central Athens at the main theatre on 2 big festivals a year for Dionysus. One was in the equivalent of our January, and it was called the Linnaea, and that was for Athenians only. So it was like the humour that you'd expected that was very much about Athenian people. Then they had a much bigger festival, which was for people from all over the Greek world, especially Athens' allies in her empire, but really all over the Greek world. I mean, we know people came from North Africa, they came from Asia Minor, they came from the Black Sea, because it was in April, which is the opening of the sailing season. And it was magnificent, and they call it the Great Dionysia or the City Dionysia. And those plays tend to have a more international and open-minded sort of world, and they have huge, wonderful, imaginative plots that extend beyond Athens to cover the whole Greek world.
Do we have comic plays that were written for both festivals, or do we only have those that were written for the Dionysia?
No, we have plays that were written for both, and we can feel the difference. As it happens, the first one we've got by Aristophanes, and is also the first comedy in world history that we've got, is called The Acharnians, and it's by Aristophanes, and it was produced in 425 BC at the Linnaea. And this is very important because Aristophanes is able to say, I can crack certain kinds of jokes here today because I don't have to worry about being prosecuted for saying bad things about Athens in front of the allies. So I can actually go further because it's just us. So it's a bit like how you can say really harsh things about each other in the family that you'd never dream of saying in the city in front of other families, right? So we actually know that they sensed a difference Sometimes we don't know. We don't know, for example, whether the Lysistrata, one of his most famous plays, is a Lenore play or a Dionysia play, unfortunately. We only know the year. Which it would be good to know, because those jokes are going to fall differently on Athenian ears from Pan-Hellenic, that means all Greek ears.
How interesting. And the jokes are also going to fall differently on whether we imagine an all-male audience or a mixed audience. So do you think there were women in the audiences?
At Comedy, I don't think there were women. I think that the ethos is one of defining a very physical, rumbustious sort of male citizen, and it's about his body and his desires. And it's very, very political in the way that it's the same community as actually votes in the Athenian assembly. It's absolutely written for the person who is an Athenian male citizen. We've also got a couple of texts, especially one in the Birds, that do very much imply that the women weren't there.
But you think that in tragedies they were in the audience?
I think tragedy was much more possible to have women at the original productions. There were certainly, for example, I think the high priestesses of Athena in the audience. Even then, for the big premieres at these big festivals, I don't think there were many women. And that's not because it wasn't regarded as sort of ideologically okay, but because everybody wanted to go so much. And there weren't enough seats even for the actual citizens, right, for everybody to go. Nobody was going to start letting somebody's wife in when there wasn't room for all the male citizens. So I think, however, there is an important matter to be discussed. These plays are re-performed across antiquity, and we can't exclude women at all from revivals. I'm talking about the big premieres.
Yeah, okay. So in the comedy of Aristophanes called The Women at Thesmophoria, the women complain about how Euripides talks about them in his tragedies. So you think that that would not be based on what they saw in the theater, but what they heard about after the fact?
Well, I think, firstly, that Euripides was so famous and so popular that, of course, everybody discussed what had gone on in the plays, even if they didn't actually get to see them at the premiere. But what is important to distinguish between is these big premieres at these two festivals in the Theatre of Dionysus on the Acropolis in central Athens, which were unbelievably prestigious and exciting, and the revivals and amateurish performances and tours that went on even in the 5th century. So by the end of the 5th century, almost every deme, that's little parish in Attica, which is the Athenian county, had some kind of theatre. And we've got a good deal of evidence that the plays by Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus were being put on in these local theatres. And I think it's very hard to exclude women from those. I don't see how you would go about doing that, because they seem to be much more ad hoc, much more impromptu, in the market square or the small theatre, which is very often adjoins the market square. So when we talk, we have to really ask whether we mean the audience of the premieres or the audience for all the revivals and local community productions which went on both in Greater Athens, Attica, and quite soon over all of the Greek world.
Were the crowds rowdy?
The crowds were extremely rowdy. The important thing here is that the plays are put on in competition against each other. You've got 3 tragedians every year, every festival competing against each other. You've got 3 comedians. The way it's judged is by a panel of scrupulously democratically selected by ballot, to avoid corruption, judges selected by ballot. And they sit and they actually do judge it. But the power of the noise from the audience meant that if they went against popular opinion, there was an incredible scandal. Okay, so you really had to vote. And that was done simply on the volume of applause. So we have a competition on British TV called The X Factor, where amateur singers, it's a talent show. But if the judges, who are called experts and pop stars, don't listen to the clapping and hooting of the audience, there's near rioting. So it is actually very, very democratic from that point of view. So there were many different ways you could make a noise, from drumming your heels, whistling, loud clapping, booing, cheering. They even sometimes booed actors off the stage if they didn't like them. Did
they ever throw things? Do we know that?
Yes, they did throw things. I don't think they didn't have the proverbial tomato yet. But absolutely, almost anything went. But I think that's very exciting. And when I sit in quiet auditoria now and everybody going shh at you if you dare to rustle your sweet paper, I think, get a life. This is a people's event. It's a community event.
So here's a question that comes to us from a listener. This is Erica from Stockholm, Sweden, who asks, how could the audience hear the actors when A, there were thousands of spectators, and B, the actors were wearing full masks?
Okay. Actors practiced for years to develop a huge volume, and they're always praised. The first word that's used for praising an actor is not he was good at making me cry or laugh, but he had megalophonia, which literally means a great big voice. And I was in a theatre just last week. I was in the ancient Greek theatre of Argos, in the orchestra where the actors would have stood. And I'm not a trained actor, but the way the theatres were built with these very steep raking of the seat, very carefully designed to protect you from the wind, I could absolutely be heard without a mask, admittedly, but by my friend who was sitting on the very, very, very top row of a theatre that could sit 17,000. The mask was very, very light. It wasn't the sort of big stone or wood thing that people imagine. It was made of linen rags dipped in something like plaster of Paris and very, very thin and lightweight. And we know that they had a big hole for their mouth. So that is not actually the issue people think it is. But they were just trained to do it. We have anecdotes about actors training by lying on the floor and having stones of increasing weight pushed on their diaphragm to do their breathing exercises. They would have been embarrassed by the kind of miking up that goes on in the musical theatre today. I mean, they would have been ashamed not to be able to be heard.
Did they have special effects?
They had some rather, I think, by today's standards of what can go on, especially in cinema, they were crude, but they were very effective. So they had two pieces of equipment, which they use constantly. One is a sort of machine for rolling out things from behind the front doors that you could almost always see, because comedy and tragedy tends to be set at the front doors of some kind of building. All right. So they have a thing that you can roll out a wonderful scene of people having a party in comedy or people who are dead in tragedy.
Just to clarify, so the scene, I mean, the backdrop of the scene in theater was made to look like a house with a door, right?
Almost always. Okay. Or a cave with a door, or a temple with a door, or a tent in a military encampment, but some sort of human habitation. So the plays are set at the exact point where private life comes out and meets public life. They discovered that by trial and error. The very earliest tragedies aren't set like that, but they discovered that created the tension which made the plays so politically charged as well as emotionally powerful. But you could roll out, and it was literally called the rolling out machine, a sort of cart to show what had been going on indoors. And then in order to be able to do either the upper world, the gods of Olympus, or the gods of the underworld, you had a crane, just like Peter Pan now flies around on harness in pantomimes. The gods could fly around on this sort of crane. And you could also have a trapdoor for ghosts or deities of the underworld to pop up.
Wow.
And we know that they had some kind of dry ice. We don't know how they did it, but they're constantly saying, oh, look at the smoke swirling around when people come up from Hades. They had a thunder machine. They could make big banging noises. We've got one wonderful papyrus that shows they had a fart machine. So I think that they were hugely inventive, but we are not talking microscopically realist cinema verite.
So in the play The Clouds, which features Socrates, I guess, flying around, right, on this crane, at the end, his thinkery, his school that Aristophanes makes fun of, is burned.
Yeah.
Would they have actually used fire?
I think so, probably. Several other plays have a big fire. The Trojan Women, a tragedy, ends with Troy burning down. I mean, why not? It's possible they just had some roll-on painted flats. We know they had painted flats, developed, in fact, to a very, very high level, but using perspective and so on. But how much more effective would it have been to have actually set fire to something wooden within the viewing frame?
And of course, there's also the chorus with music. How good do you think that music was?
I think the music was absolutely wonderful. It's much discussed in antiquity, the power of the music. People like Euripides were regarded as superb songwriters, and his choral odes, that's the songs sung by the choruses, were popular hits. People knew them off by heart. They used to sing them outside of the theatre. The music was mainly performed by these 12 or 15 strong choruses, but they trained for 6 months, and everybody was an amateur chorister in ancient Athens. Everybody. This is an oral society where everybody could sing. Everybody's trained in it from very early age. I mean, we're missing a lot of tricks now because most of our children don't get that choral training. And they're young men, probably of the age they're doing army training. Being a chorus in tragedy and comedy is probably something to do with military training. And they were trained for 6 months. We hear complaints about ones who sing flat or off key, just as you do with any amateur choral society. But the effects could be overwhelming.
So the word chorus actually means a dance, and they had to do a lot of...
It doesn't mean dance.
Oh.
It means singing and dancing at the same time.
I see.
That's exactly what it means. It means something that is incredibly hard. We imagine it to be people train at a drama school for years to go onto Broadway and do high kicks while they sing. But everybody could do that in ancient Greece. And you can sometimes see it if you see, for example, a funeral in South Africa. You see whole bodies of communities, hundreds of people, all sexes and ages, start to sing and dance together. They can do it because it's still embedded in their culture. A very great expert on Greek music, Martin West, once said that he thought that the average Athenian knew 400 songs off by heart. And they could all do it, and they could do the movements. Most of us can manage Auld Lang Syne and Happy Birthday. Do you know what I mean? But they had like another 398.
Yeah. But the movements were very complex, right? And so I guess that's why this training as a chorete might have been useful for military service.
Oh, absolutely. There's a very strong affinity from the most early times, even in Homer, between dance and drill, right? They're very, very closely allied. And of course they are. The discipline of moving together with unison, identical movements. You can absolutely see how young men who have to march around doing things with their hoplite shields and spears during the day in the gymnasium, how quickly that could and easily that could elide into being a dancing chorus pretending to be Ajax's sailors in Sophocles' Ajax, or horsemen from Deme of Acharnae in Acharnians. Did
actors ever achieve the kind of celebrity status that they do today?
Actors were mobbed. In the 5th century, slightly less. That you still have, in the earlier days of theatre, you've still got something of a ethos of ensemble, like Eastern European theatre, where people emerge from the collective and aren't quite like that. But they gradually started putting actors' prizes into the competition, as well as prizes for the playwrights, and that changed everything. So we start to know by the later 5th century, when these competitions for Best Actor, we start to know the names of the favoured actors by particular authors. By the 4th century, when there were theatres built in every Greek city across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, you had touring actors who were some of the richest men in the ancient world. We know because they did enormously expensive dedications at cult centres like Delphi.
So what's your favourite comedy from ancient Athens?
It's a very difficult question, because whenever I've seen a good production of any of them, I say that's my favourite one. But I think it does have to be The Birds. I think that the combination in that of the beautiful costumes, because they're all dressed up as different birds, and this must have been incredibly expensive. They're not all in the same uniform, so it must have been wonderfully elaborate. And just the whole wacky, imaginative, utopian idea that we're going to build a city in the sky. It's this imaginative element, and I think a very, very strong political message. It's got absolutely everything.
And what was the political context? Like, what was happening in Athens at the time that play was produced?
Well, Athens had just sent off its expeditionary task force to try and conquer Sicily. But I don't think it's anything to do with Sicily. This play is set in Thrace, which is basically the Balkans, somewhere in southern Bulgaria. Right? They talk about Olympus down there. They talk about the wars in Thrace. They name all kinds of Black Sea and northern Greek places. It's a satire on the fact that Athenians who were disgruntled, rich ones especially, if they weren't getting on well in politics, all had big estates in the Balkans where they used to go off and get lots and lots and lots of money and make lots and lots of slaves. They had gold mines. So it's a satire on how disaffected Athenians behaved the minute they got away from Athens. They started throwing their weight about. So you've got this hero who leaves Athens, very disgruntled, and goes and basically hoodwinks these rather stupid birds who stand for Thracian barbarians, really, into making him their tyrant. Exactly that. And giving himself supreme power in this place and an enormous amount of money. So it's a social satire on the dirty doings of the super rich.
And just to clarify for our listeners, the birds here actually are characters that speak and everything, right?
Absolutely.
And the main characters try to get the birds to help them build this new city up in the clouds.
Exactly. So the disaffected Athenian, who's called Satire, which means somebody very good at persuading his mates to do things, goes off with his rather stupid sidekick called Euelpides, which means eternal optimist. And they say they hate Athens, too many lawsuits, they're absolutely fed up. They say they've walked 400 miles, which about gets them to Bulgaria. And they persuade these birds that they can actually become kings of the universe, that they were there before the Olympian gods were. They can create their own Olympus and not only get lots of sacrifices and good stuff from humans below them, but also get all the powers of the gods. So it's the ultimate satire, we will make Bird City great again is the message. I mean, it really, really is. He actually says, you used to be the kings before the Olympians came along. And he uses wonderful arguments like, didn't you know the universe was born from a cosmic egg? So you're first, you came out of an egg. So he persuades them.
The birds.
Yes, that they are entitled to be kings of the universe when actually all he wants power is power for himself.
That's so interesting because we know that we have evidence for several Athenians that went up there. Like
exactly.
Thucydides had mines up there.
Absolutely.
Alcibiades went up there.
Miltiades, many of them. There's even a word for them in a fragment of Aristophanes. There's actually a word for them. And they're called the Thracophoi, which means the people who frequent Thrace. It's in a lost play, but we know they had a word for this type of person who got all his money and power from the backwaters. It's a bit like Heart of Darkness. I find it, the meaning of it's like the person who goes off and creates his own empire out in some really dark and gloomy place where lots of savagery goes on. I think it's Conrad before Conrad.
So these kind of rich Athenians with their estates up in Thrace, they have grievances with Athens, which they express in the play. So is this a critique on Athens, or is this a critique on these rich Thracophoi, or is it a critique of both?
Both. Absolutely. I mean, the system produces people like this who can sort of go off and do this. There is also a sense in which you can read the birds as gullible Athenians who are told that they've got the power, like the demos under a democracy, but are actually constantly being manipulated and orchestrated by these cynical super rich. So you could read it as a criticism both of really corrupt politicians and of gullible citizens.
So can we use this play to get a sense of the basic formula or structure of an Aristophanic comedy? Like, is there always this kind of absurd premise about either animals or something outrageous is created or subverted, or what's the basic core of these plays?
There's a basic plot, which is a problem in a community. One or two disaffected individuals set out to solve the problem. They're often given bizarre superpowers, like being able to turn into a bird, or fly to Olympus, or go down into the underworld, that sort of thing. And they effect a solution to the problem, almost always thereby improve their own situation massively, at the same time. So the community wins and the individual wins, and the play ends in reconciliation of some kind and harmony. So that is the basic plot.
So there is something of a happy ending.
Oh, yes, without a doubt. And it's got to end in a komos, in one of those, they all end in the ritual procession, where everybody, I think, files out of the theatre, probably holding the actors on their shoulders, and drinking. It merges back in to the old Dionysiac revel.
So what are the most common critiques that Aristophanes levels against the Athenian people?
Aristophanes claims in several plays that he's setting out to educate the people of Athens, to tear the veils from their eyes, to make them see what they're not seeing straight, that they're too gullible. That is a constant theme, that he's got to help them see how corrupt their politicians are or how stupid their policies are.
So he would speak as himself?
There's a peculiar element in old comedy in the middle of each play called the parabasis, where the chorus comes forward and seems, in most of the plays, to deliver, I think, like a leader in a newspaper, like an opinion piece, which is quite close to what we think Aristophanes himself, and they use the I voice, they talk as Aristophanes. It's called the parabasis. So you can test the temperature of what he's trying to say in that.
So back to the criticisms against the Athenian people.
There's one or two very particular sort of policies which Aristophanes' plays tend to criticise more than others. One is waging continuous war, even at the cost of real suffering to yourself, at the time when it's appropriate to make peace. The other is being too hard on the allies, who were actually imperial subjects and had to pay huge taxes to Athens. There's a general tendency towards criticising Athenian imperial policy if it's going too far. He never actually says the empire is wrong. It's about, means and so on. And there's definitely a lot of attacks on individual types and actually professions and groups of people within Athens, like people who sold oracles or people who took bribes to give false evidence, sycophants. That there are particular stereotypes, really, of Athenian personnel that get it a lot.
So Athens at the time was a democracy, but it was a polarized society, and there were two main factions. One was called sometimes the few, or the good and fair party, or the aristocratic party, and the other was called the many, or the democratic party. Do we know if Aristophanes was aligned with one or the other?
We don't know. And in fact, I'm a minority of one on some of this, because he is trying to win. He wants to win, which means hitting the middle. Okay? It means trying to find a consensus where most of the broad range of the middle of both of these factions could agree. Right? I think he actually really likes the average Athenian citizen. Athenian citizens were divided into 4 classes by income, property, and most of his heroes are from the bottom class. And he's deeply sympathetic towards their basic common sense and wisdom. And the hero of the knight, who eventually dislodges Cleon, the arch demagogue, is from the lowest possible social rung. He's a sausage seller, he's a hot dog man. And he gets to be the leader of Athens. So you can read that play as actually saying, well, you know what? In a really good democracy, we would actually find a capable sausage man and he'd do a jolly good job. That is a profoundly radical message. Mm-hmm. We have never, ever had a working class prime minister in Britain yet. Not once. We're run by a sort of oligarchy of educated liberal elite, as has America been normally, a truly working class leader. And Aristophanes imagines that. So while people like to say he's conservative and he's the pro the rich, I don't think that's right. I think he's flexible, wants to win, and genuinely can see goodness and badness across class.
That's interesting because, as you mentioned, he is often taught in school as like a conservative kind of comic, and yet modern reproductions that are inspired by Aristophanes, tell me if I'm wrong, but they seem to be almost always more like left-leaning. So he seems to be flexible in that way too. What
he is, well, you can load him with any meaning you like. It is true that in modern productions, his plays are used for pacifist ends, feminist ends, anti-war ends, democratic ends, liberal ends. That wasn't the case, though, until about 1880. He was almost entirely used by the right. I have researched this and written about it. So the voice of Aristophanes is used by sort of anti-Jacobins, people who oppose the French Revolution. They very much identify him as a conservative. They want him to be a conservative. So how you interpret him doesn't prove anything. Either side can interpret him how they will. I just differ from, you'll find most scholars on Aristophanes will just say he really was pro the rich, and the sort of peaceable ones who didn't really care about the empire because they were so rich anyway, they had least to lose by losing the democracy, which went very closely with the empire, which is quite difficult for people to understand. I do not think that at all. I think he was very flexible and very good at pleasing everyone.
So what do Aristophanes' plays tell us about everyday life in Athens? Because the American historian and philosopher Will Durant said, you don't know the Athenians until you know Aristophanes. And yet some people say, well, is this really good evidence?
Well, the important point is it's really the only evidence. So we've got to decide, deal with how realistic it is as a separate question. It's an extraordinary dearth of information about everyday life in 5th century Athens. The other great source for everyday life is law court speeches. And almost all of our very large number of law court speeches are from the 4th century. So if you want to find out about everyday life in Athens, you have absolutely got to use the comedy. And I think on some things, it's extraordinarily helpful. It's very good on everyday speech, on how people actually spoke to each other. It includes lots of sort of foreign words, the sort of thing that any big port city would do. And it's wonderful on food. Now, nobody ever eats anything in Greek tragedy except occasionally your own children, all right? But the body doesn't matter in Greek tragedy in this way. Food is absolutely all over comedy all the time. People are constantly cooking. Almost all the plays at the end, there's a big barbecue, actually on stage, something's sacrificed and the meat's actually handed out to the audience. And we know about 50 different words for sausage because of Aristophanes. Now, I cook. I'm really interested in that. So I would actually go with Durant.
Does Aristophanes give us like an authentic window into the Athenian family life?
There isn't actually very much about family life. Women, despite the 3 plays where women are out in public, are very thin on the ground. Most of the households that we see have a father and a son, or a man, a figure with various subordinate slaves. He's interested very much in the dynamics between citizen fathers and citizen sons, but he doesn't really tell you about how they interacted as people. He uses the older father and the younger son to represent a bigger thing about the different political attitudes intergenerationally. So he's using this as a sort of shorthand for political groups. We don't ever even meet the mum, or the sisters. So that's not what it's about. It is not about private family life.
And yet we have these 3 remarkable plays about women, the Lysistrata, the women at Thesmophoria, and the Assembly Women, all of which feature female leads, and in each of them the women of Athens band together and take control of something. In reality, though, how much of a public presence did women in Athens have?
So feminist writers on comedy, who until 30 years ago were stressing how oppressed women were in classical art, and they were in the political arena, are now saying, well, wait a minute, if we listen to these texts in a different way, they're actually telling us a different story. In sort of scholarly terms, the question is whether the statements in ancient Athens about women must be silent at all times and so on are prescriptive or descriptive, all right? If somebody comes down in 2,000 years' time and sees a sign on a motorway that says 70 miles an hour, do they think people never, ever went over 70 miles an hour? Are they saying it's descriptive, or are they saying it's a rule that is constantly broken and there was a desperate need for it because people drove too fast? I think a lot of the statements about women are because women were so noisy, because women got out on the streets when all their men were killed in the wars. Right? So when Thucydides gets Pericles to say it's the greatest glory of a woman to be silent, go home, stop crying so much in public over the dead. Is he describing silence, or is he so horrified by the presence of these women throwing things at him at the state funeral because all their men are dead? So it's a very difficult thing, and really it's where you come from on the evidence is where you want it to be. I mean, I want a much more noisy and troublesome female populace that might indeed do something like take over the Acropolis. I tend towards that interpretation.
Because we do have a few writers, particularly Plato, that argued that women and men should have the same social standing in society. And Plato says in the Republic that women in a democracy have more rights than in other constitutions.
Yeah.
But do you think that Aristophanes would have been more in line with Plato, thinking that women and men might actually have the same political capabilities, or more in line with Aristotle, who thought that men should be in politics?
You know what? That's a really difficult question. I don't think Aristophanes thought there was any place for women actually in politics. The point about Praxagora, who is that ordinary citizen, housewife, heroine of the women who take over the assembly, is that she's just so extraordinarily exceptional, and she's a prodigy, and sometimes prodigies prove the rule. You know, that's how they often function. If you talk about a thoroughly exceptional woman who can do something really strange, like she's learned how to do public speaking because she happened to live just by the assembly, so she used to overhear it, the prodigy can actually somehow shore up the normality of the distinction. So I think that we can't really imagine that Aristophanes has got any very strongly feminist views. What I do think happened in Athens, though, was that in 413, which is just a little 2 years before the Lysistrata and the women at the Symphoria, a vast proportion of all the Athenian citizen men were killed. I mean, there is a very great lack of men.
In the Sicilian expedition.
In the Sicilian expedition. And when there is a very great lack of men in any society, we know this from, after the First World War, women had to be given the vote in Britain. They had fought for years, never got it on fighting for it. Once you had decimated an entire generation of men, they had to be given the vote because somebody had to run the country. So there may well something in 411 about women actually having to man the pumps, as it were.
Fascinating.
Female characters in both tragedy and comedy can occasionally have extraordinarily strong presences. And this is something that you don't really see in other pre-modern societies. Yet many scholars think that Athens was more repressive towards women than other societies. How could that be?
Some women in ancient Greece had extraordinarily important public roles. The priestess of Athena in Athens was an unbelievably important and responsible job. It was hereditary, it was in a particular family, and she had to live on the Acropolis and was in some sense sort of queen. I mean, she really was. And we know from very early on with the first democratic revolution that the then priestess of Athena on the Acropolis stood up single-handedly against the Spartans. I mean, that's a historical source.
Wow. And
said, you will not enter this shrine, and terrified them. And when Lysistrata was performed, we happen to know that the high priestess of Athena in Athens was a woman called Lysimache, which means exactly the same. It means the woman who stops the battles as opposed to the woman who puts an end to the army. And we know she was there, and she may well have been telling the women that they needed to put pressure on the men to come to peace after the 411, right? So just because women haven't got the very specific rights in the assembly and in the law courts and economically, doesn't mean they haven't got all kinds of ways of exerting power and persuasion.
And if you could ask Aristophanes one question?
Aristophanes?
Yeah.
Ask Aristophanes one question. How close was he actually to Cleon? They're from the same deme. They said they hated each other in public, but I've always had a suspicion that they've actually really helped each other's careers.
They were frenemies? Yes.
And they were from the same deme, and that really matters in ancient Athens, that, they would have regularly been at local feasts together and so on. And Aristophanes is about 20 years younger and made his career because of Cleon. His first big win on his own was with the Knights, in which, without Cleon, he'd never have got it. Cleon went on straight after that to be elected general. So it was a win-win situation. So I would like, did he really hate him as much as scholars have said he did, just because he made such extended fun of him?
The American philosopher and historian Will Durant once said, quote, "Aristophanes is an unclassifiable mixture of beauty, wisdom, and filth." So given the vulgarity and the gold bits of satire and wisdom and everything, is this really great literature?
It's some of the best literature of all time. The filth is to be embraced. The filth is about a wonderful frankness and honesty, a lack of hypocrisy about the human body and that we all share and our own functions. I have absolutely no problems. Nobody would have called it sort of filth in those days. And it's part of a programme of frankness and getting to the bottom of things. Nobody had ever done extraordinary scenarios the way he did, the sort of extraordinary supernatural journeys into allospheres that actually lie behind so much of our science fiction. That kind of imaginative displacement. His superheroes, ordinary citizens, I love this, who save the city, and they are ordinary. It's got a utopian bent because it's born in a democracy, and it's just endlessly witty. In the actual reading, the Greek is a joy to read. It's very difficult to translate, but it's an absolute joy to read. I put him up there as one of the three most important ancient Greek writers.
Edith Hall, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I much enjoyed it.
Next time, we're going to investigate a tale that is as outlandish as any plot of Aristophanes, except some people think it's true. I'm referring to the lost city of Atlantis. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about ancient theater, you can visit the webpage for this episode at greasepodcast.com/12, where we've put up some recommended books by our guest Edith Hall. You'll also find some links to other podcasts and documentaries that she's been on that you might want to check out. Today marks exactly 1 year since this podcast was launched. I cannot believe that thousands of people from over 50 countries all around the world have tuned in to learn about the ancient world. It's really a beautiful thing that we're all connected by our common curiosity about the past. Thank you all so much for listening and for keeping it real. In the spirit of Athenian comedy, I think we should end on a festive note. I'll leave you with a very funny song from our friend Doug Metzger over at the Literature and History podcast. If you aren't already listening to that show, you need to check it out, because there's nothing else like it in the podcast world for ancient Greek literature. Once again, it's called Literature and History. This song is from one of the episodes on Aristophanes. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time.
Who is the funniest man in ancient Greece? Aristophanes. Who wrote the clouds and birds and peace? Aristophanes. Who made fun of everyone from average Joes to Pericles, the rain, the snows, the moon, the sun? Aristophanes. Public feuds with demagogues? Aristophanes. First prize for his play, The Frogs? Aristophanes. Tasteless jokes about farts and sex, a profound fondness for feces and inappropriately used objects? Aristophanes. He was deep and endless as the ocean. He dragged his feuds up onto stages. He was not shy about self-promotion because it helped him earn his wages. Signs of his plays made from brass made newcomers scoff. Said, I hope you have a backup as you're about to laugh yours off. Aristophanes, Aristophanes, Aristophanes.